The lights on the 24th floor of the Matt Crestwood Financial Tower flickered faintly, casting long reflections on the glass walls that overlooked the sleeping city. It was nearly midnight, the kind of hour when the office air turned. Cold, the coffee in forgotten mugs sat undisturbed, and the laughter of the day had long since vanished except tonight. It hadn't. From the corner by the elevator, the soft, rhythmic squeak of a cleaning cart echoed down the hallway like a quiet metronome. James Nolan moved slowly, his steps steady and deliberate. The blue of his janitor's uniform had faded from years of wear, and the once white patch with his name was now the color of old paper. His hands, rough with calluses and cracked from cleaning chemicals, gripped the mop handle with quiet familiarity. He didn't speak. He never did. The hallway lights dimmed as he passed under them. A man not meant to be seen only passed by. But for a moment, James stopped. He reached into his breast pocket and unfolded a small, creased photograph. It was Lily smiling wide with her to front teeth missing, pigtails tied with mismatched ribbons. She looked like sunshine trapped in paper. James's tired eyes softened as he stared down at her. "Almost there, baby girl," he whispered. To no one. His voice, gravelly from disuse, disappeared into the sterile silence. He put the picture back. Once upon a time, James had walked the polished floors of university halls, not corporate ones. He had been a rising star in the linguistics department at the University of Chicago. His professors had called him gifted fluent in 6 languages, reading ancient Greek like bedtime stories, translating cuneiform for fun. He was supposed to get his PhD, publish, teach, travel. But life doesn't always wait for potential. When his wife, Clara, died during childbirth, James didn't hesitate. He left everything, his research, his dissertation, his dreams, because Lily needed him. And Lily was everything. So he cleaned buildings. At night he worked. At dawn he packed her lunch. By morning he helped her with homework and braided her hair. The hours were long, the pay barely enough, but she was safe. She was loved. Still, it wore him down. On the 24th floor, a burst of laughter broke the quiet. The interns, young, loud, dressed in sharp suits that probably still had their tags. They lounged in the break room like it was their kingdom high off Red Bull and the arrogance of thinking the world belonged to them. James didn't look up. He steered his cart toward the corner and dipped the mop into the bucket. Water sloshed gently, then stilled. "You missed a spot," one intern chuckled last week. James had nodded and quietly fixed it. But tonight, something different hung in the air. Maybe it was the way they looked at him as he entered, eyes glinting with mischief, or maybe it was the way Amanda, the new recruit, glanced his way and then looked down quickly, ashamed. They didn't know the truth. They didn't see the mind behind the mop, the brilliance beneath the uniform. They only saw a janitor. But James Nolan, he had once been a man who could translate the unspoken. And tonight, someone was about to ask the wrong question. The laughter from the break room echoed louder than it should have at that hour. It clashed with the quiet, polished silence of the Matt Crestwood Tower like graffiti on glass. James Nolan kept his back to them, mop sliding in slow arcs across the marble floor, but his ears caught every word. He didn't react, not to the laughter, not to the mock bravado, not even to the whispering that followed him into every room like a shadow he could never mop away. "Yo, Amanda, bet you $10 he doesn't even speak English," one of the interns snorted. James didn't flinch. "Nah, man," Brett chimed in louder, his voice cocky and sharp. "Let's make it more fun. Hey, janitor." James straightened slowly and turned, mop still in hand. His face gave away nothing, no annoyance, no shame, just the same calm, unreadable mask he wore every night. Brett stood up, tall and grinning, holding out his phone. "You want to make more money than you've seen in your life? I'll Venmo you my entire month's salary right now. Just translate this." The phone screen glowed with a photo of aged parchment, symbols and lines etched in a language long forgotten. It wasn't Latin, not exactly. It was rough, twisted, older, maybe pre-Roman. Something out of a museum, not a finance office. Amanda's single quotes, eyes widened. "Brett, that's from the vault. Don't mess with that." But Brett just smirked, waving the phone at James like a baited hook. What's the matter? Too tough. Come on, man. Surprise us, or at least mop in a different corner. Your cart smells like bleach. One of the others laughed under his breath. Another took out their phone to film. James stepped forward. The room quieted as he gently wheeled his cart aside. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took the phone. His fingers were rough, stained with years of hard labor, but they moved with unexpected delicacy. He stared at the screen for a long moment. It was like watching an old engine slowly come back to life. Then he spoke. His voice was clear, crisp, deliberate. The oath of succession, he began. Transcribed during the late Republican era. It reads, and then he translated, not just a few words, the entire passage, and not just in English. He first gave the literal Latin breakdown, then converted it to modern phrasing with flawless grammar. His tone didn't change, but his presence did. The room had held a janitor a moment ago. Now it held a scholar. Brett blinked. Wait, what? But James wasn't done. He glanced at the final phrase and repeated it, this time in ancient Greek. The dialect was obscure. Then he switched to French, then to German, then to Mandarin Chinese. Each word rolled off his tongue as if he had lived in those countries, sat under their suns, walked their streets, and breathed their histories. No accent, no hesitation, just quiet, devastating brilliance. When he finally looked up, the break room had gone still. Even the Red Bull cans sat untouched. James handed back the phone gently. Just a dad who didn't get to finish his PhD, he said. But I remember what I read. Brett's mouth opened, then closed. Amanda stared at him. That, she began, then turned to Brett. That's not just some random file. That was a piece of encrypted material from a client's legacy archive. We've been trying to get that translated for weeks. One of the other interns whispered, wait, that was a legal will, right? A new voice cut through the silence. Is that the translation? Everyone turned. It was Mr. Kessler, vice president, the man no one saw after 5 p.m. Now standing in the doorway of his corner office, his silver hair reflected the office lights. Like burnished steel, his gaze locked onto James. Let me see that, Kessler said. Brett hesitated, then handed him the phone. The VP scanned it, then looked up at James. Where did you learn this? His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even surprised. It was something deeper, like he was recognizing something familiar in James's eyes. University of Chicago, James replied quietly. Linguistics and classics. Before life happened. Kessler didn't respond right away. His eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but in thought. Then he nodded once, slowly. Thank you, Mr. Nolan. He walked away without another word. The intern stood frozen. The laughter from 10 minutes ago had vanished like it had never existed. Only Amanda remained still, staring at James like she was seeing him for the very first time. He returned to his mop. But something in the air had shifted. Behind him, Brett sat down heavily, still processing what had just happened. And outside the glass wall, the city lights flickered. Far below, life went on. But on the 24th floor, everything had changed. Because one man, pushed to the background for years, had spoken a language no one expected. And the silence that followed him was now filled with awe. The next morning, the 24th floor of the Matt Crestwood Financial Tower didn't buzz with its usual brand of artificial cheer. The espresso machine sputtered untouched, keyboards clicked more slowly, and the usual gossip whispers had been replaced by something more fragile. Curiosity wrapped in disbelief. James Nolan arrived through the freight elevator as usual, his faded blue uniform pressed neatly, his lunch packed in a brown paper bag, with Lily's drawing on the side, a crayon heart with the words for Daddy scrawled inside it. He nodded to the security guard on duty. No one else said anything. But today, he didn't head to the janitor's closet. A woman waited for him by the elevators. She wore a navy skirt suit, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp but not unkind. Mr. Nolan. James blinked. No one had ever called him Mr. in that building before. Yes? You've been requested to report to the 26th floor, executive wing, conference room 3. Follow me, please. There was a moment of hesitation in James's steps, like a man who's been living in shadows. For so long he flinches at the light, but he followed. The elevator ride was silent. He stood between glass walls that once reflected nothing but cleaning fluid and mop handles. Now they mirrored something else, something shifting. When the elevator doors opened, James stepped into a world that seemed carved from marble and silence. Deep oak paneling, framed art worth more than his annual rent, and a long stretch of windows that framed the city like a masterpiece. In Conference Room 3, a long table sat polished like still water. Waiting there were 5 people, 3 suited attorneys, 1 HR manager, and Vice President Kessler at the head. "Please sit," Kessler said without a smile, but there was no condescension either, only precision. James did. The HR manager slid a folder across the table. "We're offering you a formal position within Crestwood Financial Senior Translation Consultant. Immediate hire. Your compensation package includes a 6-figure salary, housing assistance, flexible work hours, and a full education trust for your daughter, Lily." James didn't respond right away. His fingers brushed the edge of the folder, but his thoughts were far away on Lily's cough last week, on the rent notice that nearly tipped his balance, on the nights he stood at her bedroom door just listening to her breathe, afraid of the world stealing her like it stole her mother. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I think there's been a mistake." Kessler leaned forward. "There hasn't." James met his gaze. "I'm not someone you want in this room." One of the attorneys opened his mouth, but Kessler raised a hand to stop him. "You translated a document our software flagged as impossible. You corrected an archive clause in multiple languages without notes. We had that in escrow for months. Do you know how much money you saved us last night?" James didn't answer. Kessler nodded to the attorney, who placed a stack of documents on the table. "This is a contract. You don't have to sign it now. But if you want to change your life, it's yours." There was silence, the kind that stretches deep and ancient, like a river deciding which way to flow. Finally, James said, "May I make one request? Anything. I want to pick Lily up from school every day." Kessler blinked. "Done." And just like that, the room changed. James Nolan, janitor, stood and shook the VP's hand. But it wasn't triumph on his face. It was something quieter, something stronger, the look of a man who had been buried and had chosen to rise with dignity instead of rage. Later that afternoon, as the rest of the building buzzed with the story, "Did you hear about the janitor? He's not a janitor anymore." Brett sat alone in the break room, staring at his untouched coffee, his face pale, his fingers tapping on the table in growing agitation. Amanda entered but didn't sit near him. "You okay?" she asked. Gently. Brett laughed, but it was bitter. "He made me look like an idiot." "He didn't," she said. "You did that all on your own." Brett stood and stormed out. He had been the golden intern. Now he was just the guy who got publicly outsmarted by the janitor. But this wasn't about ego anymore, because Brett had just learned the difference between knowledge and wisdom, and he didn't like how it felt. Meanwhile, James walked out of the building with a new badge clipped to his shirt, one that no longer read Janitorial Services. It simply said James Nolan, Translation Consultant. He passed the same security guard, who gave him a silent nod of respect. And as he walked to his beat-up car, the wind tousled his hair, and the city skyline seemed to shimmer differently, like maybe, just maybe, it had finally seen him. In the passenger seat, Lily's booster waited. So did tomorrow, and James wasn't mopping shadows anymore. He was translating his own life one chapter at a time. The sun rose slowly over the skyline of Chicago, bleeding amber across the mirrored windows of Crestwood Financial Tower. But on the 24th floor, the light didn't bring comfort. It brought heat, pressure, the kind that made people sweat inside designer suits and check their emails twice before sending. Brett sat stiffly at his workstation, jaw clenched. His tie was knotted too tightly, and his fingers hovered over the keyboard like they'd forgotten what to type. Screens surrounded him, legal briefs, translation drafts, a blurred copy of that same document James Nolan had translated days ago. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. The building had changed, not physically but in spirit. Whispers followed James now, but they weren't mocking anymore. They were reverent. Interns held elevator doors for him. Junior analysts paused to say good morning, Mr. Nolan. Even the vending machine guy greeted him like an old friend. But Brett, he'd gone from front of the line golden boy to ghost. He seethed as he scrolled through internal reports. Buried deep in the archive files was the clause the one, from a Roman dialect no one at the firm had managed to decode for years. It had been sitting in legal limbo, halting a major merger between Crestwood's top client and an overseas partner, until James walked in and translated it in under 5 minutes. But Brett wasn't going down without a fight. He stormed into a project status meeting later that morning. The room was filled with senior managers, including Mr. Kessler and the firm's legal director, and James, calm, quiet, seated at the far end of the table with a single leather folder open in front of him. "Before we begin," Brett said, his tone stiff, "I have a concern." Everyone turned. "We're relying too heavily on one source," he continued, casting a pointed look at James. "No disrespect, but credentials matter. We can't base a multi-million-dollar legal argument on a janitor's hunch." The room froze. James didn't react. He simply reached into his folder and pulled out a sheet of parchment, a printed facsimile of the clause Brett was referring to. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry. "This," James said, "is the original clause, transcribed in pre-Julian Roman dialect. It was misfiled as ceremonial text." He placed it in the center of the table. "But it's not ceremonial, it's conditional. The merger agreement included a stipulation that would nullify the contract if not fulfilled in the same dialect used in the originating clause." Crestwood had been responding in formal Latin. That's why the other party wasn't honoring it. He handed over a second page. "This is the correct translation. And this," he paused, sliding forward a final document, "is the drafted response I submitted yesterday. The other firm has already acknowledged receipt. Their counsel confirmed this morning they are reactivating the agreement. The merger will proceed. Silence. Utter. Stunned silence. Mer. Kessler cleared his throat. "How much is that deal worth?" The legal director replied quietly, 14.2 million. Brett's face turned the color of ash. No one spoke. To him, no one needed to. The board applauded James, not out of obligation but out of sheer disbelief and admiration. He had not only cracked the code, he had saved the firm from walking blindly into a lawsuit that could have shattered its reputation. Brett was asked to leave the room. As the door closed behind him, James remained seated. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked down at his notes and turned the page, ready for the next problem. That evening, the story traveled across departments like wind through dry grass. Employees in tech support heard it from their manager. Paralegals whispered it during lunch. Even the CEO mentioned the janitor who speaks dead languages during an investor briefing. And while the world adjusted to the new legend walking quietly through their halls, James left the building like he always did. No limo, no fanfare. But his briefcase was heavier that night. Inside it, tucked carefully between legal briefs and translation notes, was a new drawing from Lily. It showed a stick figure in a suit holding a briefcase, standing next to a little girl in pigtails. Under it she had written in red crayon, "My daddy can read secret things." James folded the picture and placed it in his coat pocket, beside the old one. He was no longer cleaning up after others' success. He was writing it. And somewhere in a quiet office, Brett stared at his empty desk, realizing the worst part wasn't losing a project. It was being exposed as someone who had never seen the brilliance that passed him every night with a mop. Rain painted streaks on the tall glass walls of Matt Crestwood Financial Tower, turning the city outside into a blur of headlights and soaked umbrellas. The evening crowd had emptied long ago. The building was down to skeleton staff and silence. Only a few lights flickered across the upper floors, places where ambition outlasted the clock. James Nolan sat alone in a corner office now marked with his name. His fingers moved over ancient parchment scans on his laptop screen, adjusting tonal markers in a dialect so obscure that even AI translation models failed to touch it. The rhythm of it soothed him, not because it was easy, but because it made sense. Language always made sense. People, on the other hand, people were chaos wrapped in suits and smiles. His phone buzzed. "A message from Lily, Daddy. Did you get my art?" James smiled, reaching into his coat pocket. He unfolded the new crayon. Drawing. This time, it was a castle, and at its gates stood the same stick figure version of himself but now wearing a crown. He was still smiling when a knock came at his office door. He turned. Not many people stayed that late, and no one ever knocked. Outside stood a woman in a long brown coat, rainwater dripping from the hem. Her gray hair twisted into a loose bun. She looked out of place like someone who belonged in a lecture hall, not a financial tower. Her eyes held something familiar, something old. "James?" she asked softly. He stood. "Yes." She stepped in slowly. "I'm Professor Elaine Voss. I taught linguistics at the University of Chicago." Time froze. James blinked. He hadn't heard that name in nearly 2 decades. Elaine took a step forward, her voice trembling. "You were my student. You were my best student." James looked down for a moment, gathering himself, the weight of the years, of choices, of sacrifice all pressing inward at once. "You were the one who gave me that thesis on Proto-Celtic syntax," she said. "The one with the handwritten margins. You still remember that?" James asked, quietly stunned. Elaine smiled sadly. "James, your work was unforgettable. And then, you vanished. No one knew why. Not until I saw your name on the news feed this week." He motioned for her to sit, his own hands shaking slightly now. "I got the call," she said, settling into the chair opposite him. "An old colleague forwarded me the clip. Janitor stuns firm with ancient Greek translation. I saw your face, and I couldn't believe it. Not because it was you, because I always believed in you, but because the world had forgotten." James leaned forward. "I didn't forget. I just had other things to take care of, Lily. She needed me, and I couldn't let her grow up without a parent. The university couldn't wait." Elaine's eyes welled. "You gave up everything?" "No," James replied. "I rerouted. I never gave it up. I just carried it in my pocket until I could use it again." She nodded slowly, reaching into her coat and pulling out a folder. "I came here for another reason. I'm founding a new remote-based research institute. We'll focus on global language preservation, translation training, and cultural mentorship. It's hybrid, flexible, and we need a lead scholar." James's breath caught. "But more than that," she continued, "we need someone who understands that brilliance doesn't always come in lab coats or Ivy halls. Someone who knows what it means to be overlooked. Someone who can lead with humility. Someone like you." He stared at her, his throat suddenly dry. "I only just started here." "You wouldn't have to leave," she said. "Just expand. The world needs you, James. Not just in boardrooms, but in classrooms again. Not as a janitor, not even just as a translator, but as a mentor." A beat of silence passed between them. "Why me?" he whispered. Elaine gave a faint, tearful smile. "Because you didn't let the world harden you. You kept your gift alive in silence, and you used it not to make noise but to serve. That's the kind of person I want shaping the next generation." He looked at Lily's drawing again, the one with the crown dot, then back at Elaine. "Can I think about it?" "Of course," she said. "But James, yes? You've already started building something far bigger than a career. You've started a legacy." She stood to leave. "You don't have to be in the spotlight to light the way for others." As she walked into the rainy night, James sat still for a long time, long enough to hear his past knocking on the door, not with judgment, but with invitation. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was catching up to life. He felt like he was finally leading it. The hall smelled like old wood and chalk dust, the kind of scent that only lived in universities untouched by time. Stained glass windows cast colored light across polished stone floors. The auditorium had changed in small ways. New screens, new lighting, but the weight of knowledge still hung in the air like incense. James Nolan stood at the entrance, holding a worn leather satchel. His heart beat in a way it hadn't in years, not out of fear, but memory. Everything about the place pulled him backward, to a time before the graveyard shifts, before Lily's first tooth, before cleaning solution and tired muscles had replaced textbooks and quiet lectures. He took a deep breath. Today, he wasn't a student. He was the guest of honor. The invitation from Professor Elaine Voss had come weeks earlier, followed by a call from the university's board. They wanted him to deliver a keynote, Language as Survival, the Hidden Power of the Overlooked. A fancy title, too academic for James's taste, but he said yes, because it wasn't about him anymore, that it was about who might be sitting in the last row on the verge of quitting, or already invisible, just waiting for someone to see them. The lecture hall filled quickly. Students in hoodies and headphones filed in, along with professors in tweed jackets and assistants carrying tablets. No one really knew what to expect. Some whispered about the janitor guy who cracked the ancient clause. Others just came for extra credit. But when James stepped onto the stage, the murmurs faded. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't bring a slideshow. Just a few notes and a heart full of story. He began not with facts but with silence. A pause so long it made people lean in. I was 27, he said finally, and 2 weeks away from defending my thesis. When the call came, my wife was gone. My newborn daughter was alive. And everything I thought I was building stopped. The room stilled. I left this university carrying a backpack of books I never got to finish, and a baby carrier. A soft inhale rippled through the crowd. For the next 15 years, I cleaned buildings, changed light bulbs, unclogged sinks, all while teaching my daughter ancient Greek on flashcards between laundry loads. Not because I had something to prove, but because I couldn't let the part of me that loved language die. He stepped closer, to the edge of the stage, and then one night, someone handed me a phone and said, "Translate this, and my salary is yours." Some students nodded. They had seen the clip, heard the story. But hearing it from James's mouth felt different, like hearing an ancient truth come back to life. I didn't speak to impress them. I spoke because it's what I know. Because what we bury doesn't disappear. It waits. And if we keep watering it even when no one sees, it grows. He shared more than translation techniques. He decoded life. How silence wasn't weakness, but preparation. How knowledge carried in the shadows is no less powerful than knowledge in the spotlight. How sometimes the most brilliant minds mop floors, not because they failed but because life demanded they prioritize love over prestige. Then came the question segment. A girl in the front raised her hand, eyes wide. "Professor Nolan, what was the hardest thing you ever had to translate?" The room waited. James didn't blink. "Grief," he said softly, "and sacrifice, and failure. Those are hard languages, full of words we don't want to learn." He paused, "But once you learn them, they unlock everything else." In the back, Elaine Voss stood near the door, tears glistening in her eyes. She wasn't the only one. Later that night, James walked through campus alone. He passed the dorms, the library, the quiet corners where he once read Homer under dim lights. It felt different now, not painful, not nostalgic, just full circle on a campus bench. He sat and opened Lily's latest drawing. This one showed his school, with a tiny figure at a podium, smiling. Above it, in purple crayon, "My daddy teaches people how to speak heart words." He smiled and looked up at the night sky. There were still languages to learn, still people to reach. And finally, James Nolan had the platform to do both. The auditorium pulsed with murmurs, camera flashes, and the rustling of proud families settling into their seats. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of Lincoln Academy's hall, painting golden stripes across the backs of navy blue gowns and tassels. The scent of fresh flowers and freshly printed programs drifted through the air. It was graduation day, and ending, yes, but also something more sacred, a beginning. James Nolan sat in the front row, dressed in a tailored gray suit, not expensive, but dignified. A soft gray tie, his shoes polished, his back straight, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the folded program in his lap. On the cover, Lincoln Academy Commencement Ceremony, Class of 2029. And in bold at the bottom, Valedictorian, Lily Ellen and Nolan. He exhaled, not because he was nervous, but because everything he had been running toward, crawling through darkness to reach, was now about to step across that stage. When his name wasn't in the halls of prestige, when he was mopping floors for men who couldn't pronounce the languages he read fluently, when he was up at 3 a.m., cleaning bathrooms, and reading Latin aloud to a child half asleep on the couch. He never once imagined this day. He didn't allow himself to. Hope, after all, could be dangerous when rent was due and your kid needed antibiotics. But now he sat among senators, COs, and legacy families with old money and older last names, and no one here knew that just 4 years ago, he had scrubbed the very offices their parents worked in. He didn't care. His eyes were only for her. Lily. She stood at the side of the stage, cap secured over her dark curls, a small silver medallion gleaming around her neck. When her name was called, the applause was loud, but not louder than James's heart pounding against his ribs. She took the stage with quiet grace, holding her speech in steady hands. Then she began to speak. 4 years ago, she said, voice firm and clear, I was the girl who couldn't afford the school uniform. A soft chuckle passed through the crowd. I was the girl who sat in the back of the classroom with second-hand books and lunch from a brown paper bag. And I was also the girl whose father walked me to school every single day, sometimes in a janitor's uniform, sometimes in a suit, but always with love. James froze. What most of you didn't know, she continued, was that while some of your parents were making deals on Wall Street, mine was reading ancient Greek poetry to me at bedtime. He taught me how to conjugate verbs before I could ride a bike. He taught me to translate silence not just into words, but into strength. The room went still. A single mother in the back wiped her cheek. A history teacher nodded slowly. Even the headmaster leaned forward. Some of you know my father now as Professor Nolan, or the man who saved a $14 million contract with a single translation, or the guest lecturer whose story went viral. But to me he's just Dad. She glanced toward the front row, eyes locking with his. James blinked hard, his throat closing around something that couldn't be spoken. He once told me, Lily said, that grief, failure, and sacrifice were the hardest things to translate. But he did it anyway. He rewrote them into a language made of courage, humility, and love. And because of that, I'm standing here. She unfolded the final part of her speech. So when people ask me who my hero is, who inspired me the most, the answer is simple. She turned fully toward him. He turned a mop into a key and unlocked a future he never gave up on. The crowd stood. Applause thundered through the hall, but James didn't hear it. He saw nothing but Lily's face, radiant and glowing as she descended the stage and ran straight into his arms. And as he held her, the years of loneliness, quiet resilience, tired eyes, and whispered lullabies in Latin, all of it collapsed into that one embrace. In that moment, James wasn't the janitor or the translator or even the professor. He was the man who never stopped believing in his daughter. And now, the world believed in her. A week after Lily's graduation, the buzz surrounding James Nolan hadn't faded. It had only grown louder, taking on a life of its own. Newspapers printed headlines like "The Janitor Who Cracked $1 Million Code." Business magazines featured him in long-form think pieces titled "Hidden Brilliance: Why Corporations Miss Their Best Minds." University blogs posted videos of his guest lecture with titles like "Professor Nolan and the Power of Translation Beyond Words." James tried to ignore it. He still packed Lily's lunches, still took the early train, still made time for evening walks. He didn't want fame. He wanted peace. But the world wasn't ready to let him retreat into quiet again. On a Tuesday morning, as he stepped into Crestwood Tower, coffee in one hand, leather satchel in the other, a black town car pulled into the loading dock. It wasn't unusual for COs or legal heads to arrive that way. But this car didn't belong to anyone from the building. Inside sat Alexei Romanov, the founder and chairman of Orion Global Capital, the most powerful client Crestwood had ever had. He wasn't scheduled. He didn't call ahead, and no one saw it coming. The CEO of Crestwood, to VPS, and half the legal department were summoned immediately. Meetings were canceled. Executives whispered frantically. The building, normally ice-cold in its rhythm, felt like it was on the verge of something seismic. James, meanwhile, kept working, reviewing old translation logs for accuracy, sipping lukewarm coffee, and preparing to onboard a new junior translator that afternoon. Then his name echoed over the intercom. Mr. James Nolan, Conference room Alpha. Immediately. He stood slowly. When he entered the glass-walled room, everyone else was already seated. Romanoff himself, sharp suit, colder eyes, stood at the far end. Flanked by two assistants, he gestured toward James. "This is the man." "Yes, sir," replied Mr. Kessler. Romanoff nodded once. "Good. Then let's begin." He clicked a remote. The screen lit up with a contract, multilingual, sprawling, full of rare clauses and embedded text in dialects no living translator had ever been certified in. It was a legal labyrinth. "This," Romanoff said, "is the linchpin of our global expansion. It's a multi-billion-dollar acquisition agreement. Buried beneath 70 years of bureaucratic red tape, we've spent 9 months trying to decode it. Every I model failed. Every legal scholar hit a wall." He turned to James. "We need you." The silence was immediate. "I understand," James replied slowly. "But this language, it's not just rare, it's personal." Romanoff raised an eyebrow. "Personal?" James stepped closer to the screen, pointing to a single passage written in Proto-Aramaic. "This phrasing, I saw it once in my thesis research. It's not just a contract, it's a cultural bond. One misstep, and we don't just break a deal, we erase a people's legacy." A long pause. "Will you do it?" Romanoff asked. "We'll triple your salary, assign you a team, private jet, name your terms." James looked at Kessler, then at the stunned legal board, then back at the contract. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel nervous about his answer. "No." The room froze. "Excuse me," Romanoff said, voice sharp now. "I'll help," James said, calm and clear. "But not for money, not for power. I'll do it under one condition." Romanoff narrowed his eyes. "And that is," James stepped forward, steady as stone, "Crestwood creates a full-time language preservation division, funded, staffed, and partnered with educational institutions. I choose the scholars. I choose the mission. We use corporate power to protect dying languages, not bury them in legal conquest." Dead silence. Romanoff studied him like a chess opponent. "You'd trade a fortune for a scholarship fund and a research wing." "I'd trade it for meaning," James replied, "and for the chance to make sure no kid with a gift like mine ever has to hide behind a mop again." After a long, tension-filled moment, Romanoff chuckled. "Not mockingly. Respectfully." "Then consider it done." An eruption of quiet applause followed. James didn't smile. He didn't have to. The victory wasn't for him. It was for the unseen, the unheard, the janitors, the waitresses, the immigrants, the single dads who put knowledge aside so they could put food on the table. And when the announcement was made an hour later, Crestwood Financial and Orion Global to launch Global Translation Institute initiative in partnership with universities across 5 countries, the building buzzed with something new. Pride. Not in titles or salaries, but in a man who chose to lift others. The moment he had the power to do so, the sky that day was the kind of blue that felt deliberate to clear, to perfect, as if the universe was trying to say, "Look closely." But James Nolan wasn't looking at the sky. He was standing in front of a weathered front porch on the south side of Chicago, staring at a small, crooked mailbox with the name Nolan still barely visible under the chipped paint. It had been 20 years. The house he'd once called home now stood like a tired elder, wooden boards curling at the edges, the roof patched with mismatched tiles, and wild grass creeping over the walkway like forgotten stories reclaiming space. He hadn't come here in years, not since he packed everything into one suitcase, cradling Lily in his arms and walking away with no plan, just the crushing weight of lost. But today, he had returned, not to relive the grief but to honor it. In his hand was a folded letter. The paper was thin from age, the ink slightly smudged, and the handwriting unmistakable. Clara's. He'd found it tucked inside an old copy of Epictetus in a box of books Lily insisted they unpack. Last week, James had frozen when he saw it, the past colliding with the present so hard he had to sit down. The letter was dated a week before she died. "James, if you're reading this, it means you've chosen love over everything else. I know you. I know your heart. You were born to teach, to build bridges with words no one else understands. But more than that, you were born to be Lily's father. Never doubt that." Never let them make you feel small, because one day she will see the world through your eyes and that world will be beautiful. He read it now again, for the 5th time, standing on the porch they once argued on, danced on, lived on. His chest ached, not with sorrow but with awe. He stepped inside. The floor creaked. Dust hung in the air like memories that refused to settle. The kitchen table where they used to drink burnt coffee was still there. A broken baby swing sat in the corner, long forgotten. The window above the sink still had that crack from when Clara had thrown a spoon. During a fit of laughter, it was like time had paused here, waiting for him to come back. He sat on the couch, letter in hand, and for the first time in years, he spoke to the silence. She did see it, Clara. She saw the world, and she made it better. He closed his eyes and remembered the day Lily asked him, "Daddy, what does legacy mean?" He had stumbled over the answer. Now he knew it meant this: choosing quiet sacrifice over public applause, choosing to mop a floor rather than miss a bedtime story, choosing to carry a world on your shoulders so your child could walk lighter. His phone buzzed. A message from the new language initiative director. "Your story is being added to the curriculum. Would you consider writing a book about it?" James smiled faintly, not because he wanted to be known, but because maybe the story could become a map for someone else in the dark. He stood and looked around one last time. Then he stepped outside, closed the door, and locked it. Behind him was the place where everything started. Ahead of him, the car that would take him to a new recording studio, where his first podcast series on ancient languages and modern resilience was about to launch. And beside him, as always, Lily's crayon drawing tucked in his folder. This one had a bookshelf and a tiny cartoon microphone above the words, "My daddy teaches the world how to listen." And somewhere, he hoped, Clara was listening too. The room was vast, vaulted ceilings draped with golden lights, floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the skyline of New York City, and a stage polished to a mirror shine. Hundreds of seats lined the floor in concentric arcs, filled with people. In suits, saris, headscarves, and sweaters, linguists, tech innovators, historians, policy makers, and quiet dreamers from every continent sat shoulder to shoulder, gathered under one purpose: the preservation of human language. This was the inaugural summit of the Global Translation and Legacy Institute, and the keynote speaker, standing backstage, breathing slowly through the weight in his chest, was James. Nolan. The room buzzed with quiet reverence. Most knew the story by now how a single dad, once a janitor, had cracked a centuries-old legal code that saved a multinational merger, then turned down money for meaning. How he used his second chance to create opportunity not just for himself, but for scholars and students around the world. But no viral article or polished video could prepare them for what it felt like when the curtain drew back and James stepped onto the stage. He didn't walk like a man used to cameras. He walked like a man who had mopped 1,000 floors and still carried the silence of those nights in his bones. He stood at the podium, no teleprompter, no entourage, just a folder, a heart full of truth, and a voice that had waited years to be heard. "When I was 16, he began. I used to sit at the back of my public library and copy down ancient scripts by hand. No one taught me. No one asked me to. I just needed to know the words behind the words." He paused. "By 27, I was translating dialects most people hadn't heard of. By 28, I was changing diapers in the morning and cleaning toilets at night. And for years after that, I didn't touch a single page of old text, not because I stopped loving it, but because survival came first." The audience was still. No movement, no whispers, only the occasional breath drawn to sharply. Then one night, someone laughed and said, "Translate this and my salary is yours." And something in me, something buried, something quiet, stood up. He looked out across the crowd, not above them, but into them. I didn't win anything that night. I remembered who I was, and that was enough. A beat of silence passed, deep and sacred. We are here today because the world needs remembering. In a time where algorithms translate meaning and corporations bury culture under profit, we must become the memory keepers, not just of language but of dignity, of nuance, of silence, of sacrifice, Applause rippled gently, respectfully. This institute is not for the elite. It's for the girl in a village who speaks 6 dialects and is told none of them matter. It's for the refugee who holds an entire history in their grandmother's lullabies. It's for the boy who thinks he has to choose between loving language and putting food on the table. It's for janitors and mothers and lost scholars and children who carry too much grief into small bodies. James took a breath. Our greatest translations will not be of contracts or ancient scrolls. They will be the people we lift up, the dignity we restore, the stories we rewrite with truth, humility, and hope. He closed the folder, looked down once, then up again, because I've learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can translate is yourself. The room erupted, not with the thunder of ego-driven applause, but with something deeper. People stood slowly, reverently, like they were witnessing not a speech but a benediction. Later, as the evening wore on, and attendees drank wine and swapped business cards and promised collaborations, James stood alone by the balcony. Beneath him, the city pulsed like a living language. Behind him, the Institute's banner waved. Translation. Legacy. Humanity. His phone buzzed. A message from Lily. You were amazing. Again. The crowd had no chance. Guess what? James smiled. What? He texted back. She replied with a picture her. University acceptance letter. Linguistics major. Full scholarship. Under his name. Beneath the photo she'd written, you translated the world for me. Now it's my turn. James put the phone away, blinking hard at the city lights. He didn't need a spotlight. Didn't need a statue. He had already built his monument out of sacrifice, silence, and love, not in stone, but in her. And the world would never forget the janitor who turned a mop into a key, who opened a door not just for himself but for generations to come.